was done in 3 shifts. "1945 witnessed the victory of the Allies and the victor himself, Winston Churchill, who made several voyages on the Queens during the course of the war. As the troops who had crossed the Atlantic in the dark and dangerous days streamed homeward, triumphant on the same great liners that had taken them to Europe, Winston Churchill, also resting from his labors, sailed with them in the Queen Elizabeth on January 9, 1946. And on the day before they reached New York, the 12,000 soldiers on board broke off from their daily chores to listen to a speech addressed to them by the ex-Prime Minister. My friends and shipmates on the Queen Elizabeth, for most of you it is homeward bound. The seas are clear, the old flag flies, and those who have done the work turn home again, their task accomplished, their duty done. What a strange, fearful, yet glittering chapter this war has been. What changes it has wrought throughout the world and in the fortunes of so many families. What an interruption in all the plans each of us had made. What a surrender of the liberties we prized. What a casting away of comfort and safety. What a pride in peril. What a glory shines on the brave and the true. The good cause has not been overthrown. Tyrants have been hurled from their place of power, and those who sought to enslave the future of mankind have paid, or will pay, the final penalty. Yesterday I was on the bridge, watching the mountainous waves and this ship, which is no dory, cutting through them. I asked myself, why is it that the ship beats the waves when they are so many, and the ship is one? The reason is that the ship has a purpose, and the waves have none. They just flop around, innumerable, tireless, but ineffective. The ship with the purpose takes us where we want to go. Let us therefore have purpose, both in our national policy and in our private lives. Thus the future will be fruitful, for each and for all, and the reward of the warriors will not be unworthy of the deeds they have done. The war was over, but there was one last mission to accomplish before the 2 queens could both be demobilized. There were some 25,000 European girls, most of them British, who had married American servicemen. And now these GI brides, together with some 15,000 newborn children, needed to be carried across the North Atlantic. The victors came back to their loved ones, but there were those who would never return from the field of battle, leaving but a memory behind them, or merely a name carved out of a pocket knife. Or as the English poet Rupert Brooke, himself a casualty of an earlier war, once wrote, "If I should die before the morn, think only this of me, that there is a corner in some foreign field that will always be a part of England." The Elizabeth was the first of the queens to return to peacetime service in the autumn of 1946, when she was hastily refurbished in order to commence the maiden voyage which her sister ship had made 10 years earlier, and which she had had to forego in 1940. The task of fitting the ship up properly was immense. There were ghosts in the grand saloons of the great liner, vanished hopes and pleasures of the 1930s brought about by the war, and more tangibly, the lingering presence of 1.5 million servicemen who had marked their passage with an all-enveloping cobweb of scribblings and carvings. There was one school of thought in favor of retaining the wooden deck rails of the Queens, scarred with the initials of regiments, loved ones, and comrades, and so for a time they escaped the joiner's plane. But Cunard was never a company noted for sentimentality, and perhaps in 1946 they were in stride with the times. For their 2 great liners, now the make-or-break factors in the company's economic survival, were already dangerously close to being monumental artifacts of history themselves. The inactiveness of any ship can cause grave financial woes almost overnight, and so rather than dry dock the Elizabeth at John Brown's to be properly refitted for commercial service, workers were brought down from the Clyde to Southampton. Layers of camouflage were chipped off the Queen Elizabeth to be replaced by 30 tons of paint in the company colors. Her 26 lifeboats took on at last the sparkling white liveries to which they were entitled. Polishers worked feverishly at bringing back the gloss on the 4,500 tables, chairs, and settees, while 4,000 mattresses, 6,000 curtains and bedspreads, 2,000 carpets, and 1,500 wardrobes and dressing tables were taken out of mothballs. In the autumn of 1946, 10 years after her sister's maiden crossing, the Queen Elizabeth was ready for all the clamor and excitement befitting a Queen's maiden debut after a final hosing and scrub down of the decks. With everything completely overhauled within the public rooms and engine room in proper order, morning roll call, as in any military school in England, was also carried out on the Queen's, where an inspection of the many contingents of stewards, engineers, cooks, bakers, pursers, waiters, pages, nurses, and sailors that make up the 1,300 crew members is carried out by the staff captain each morning as they muster on the promenade deck, calling out their names, dressed in the uniforms of their position while donning life jackets. This precautionary measure was impressed on the British Merchant Marine by the Board of Trade ever since the disaster of the Titanic, when the White Star liner went down in 1912 with insufficient lifeboats. The mandatory lifeboat drill becomes a part of the crew's training to ensure the safety of the thousands of passengers who on the first day out at sea will also take part in the exercise. Taking on bunkers for the liner is an overnight job, as the oil on which she will run is taken in from barges. Besides the hundreds of thousands of pieces of china and silverware, there are tons of foodstuffs, wines, liquors, tobacco, and specialties for those on restricted diets. On the day of sailing, a special boat train is appropriated for the hour and 45-minute ride by the British Rail service for the trip from London to Southampton, where the passengers will embark. The passengers arrive at the covered piers, for they have now come into a ghostly country that is no longer here and not yet there. Especially at night, there is a hazy yellow vault full of shouting, echoing voices and escaping steam. There is the rumble of trains, motor cars, and the clump of trunks, the strident chatter of a crane, and the first salt smell of the sea. You hurry through, even though there's time. The past, the continent is behind you. The future is that glowing mouth on the side of the ship. This dim, turbulent alley is too confusedly the present. Up the gangway, and the vision of the world adjusts itself. One is a citizen of a commonwealth smaller than Andorra. One is no longer sure of anything. Curiously unmoved, the ship personnel preview the new visitors with curious eyes, and the master of the floating city, from his lofty place above, thinking something of his own as he stares at the crowds below. Then the loud, mournful whistle, and the thing, certainly not the ship, but rather a human idea, a frame of mind, is eased from her mooring quay by a gang of tugboats who nudge the sleeping Leviathan from its resting place. Slowly pulling away from the dockside, which diminishes in size as the behemoth emerges from its stupor. The hull garners momentum as the concerted pushes of the tugboats take hold. A turn in the direction of the open seas, a breath of steam to fill her rotors, and the great sea creature, now awoken, pushes through the dark night. Technological advancements in the 1950s had threatened the Queen's when U.S. Line's 51,000-ton SS United States won the Blue Ribbon with her phenomenal speed of 33.50 knots. But speed was not a priority for many a seasoned voyager who were of the opinion that getting there was half the fun. And when the Queens were fitted for stabilizers in the mid-50s, they became even more comfortable to travel in. Travel in the 50s lacked some of the fanfare of the 30s. Gone were the social stratums of Edwardian England. The stock market tickler, which was one of the norms of first class, was now silent. Many of the staterooms on the ships became interchangeable with first and tourist, as cabin class was done away with entirely. Young debutantes who were once escorted to the captain's ball by their black tie escorts were now replaced by cigar-wielding garment businessmen, off to Paris to copy the latest fashions for mass production. Life in general was changing rapidly on both sides of the Atlantic. The world was becoming crowded, cities congested. By 1960, the panoramic New York skyline was covered by a low drooping haze of pollution that hung over the city's skyscrapers. Air travel was fast becoming the medium of travel for the faster modes of lifestyle. And as the years wore on, fewer and fewer luxury liners could be seen tied up along the Hudson River. For the time being, ocean travel held its own against the encroaching airlines, which not only threatened Cunard, but every ocean carrier. The familiar pastime of playing shipboard games after a hearty breakfast helped one stay in shape if one chose not to jog around the 400 yards of open deck or work out in the gymnasiums and swimming pool, though the salty air was sufficient to stimulate the appetite for the next gourmet meal. For the less agile, there were indoor games such as bingo, bridge, and if one considered their judgment as a mariner adequate, one might wager in the daily pool to estimate the number of sea miles covered in the ship's track. For the more lethargic traveler, there was hot bouillon at 10 a.m. while reading one's favorite book, a movie at noontime, and to top the afternoon off, tea and petit fours at tea time. For the torpid traveler, basking in the sun was the only way to cross. While passengers enjoyed themselves on the 4-day voyage, the business of the ship went on 24 hours, as the ship steamed full speed ahead. The 50s brought about not only social and economic changes, but technological as well. Radar, which had come about during the war when it was used to locate submarines, was now used to scan the waters in the ship's path. The helmsman was replaced by an instrument called the automatic pilot, which now steered the ship on its course. The crow's nest was obsolete. Slicing through the high seas, the Queens traveled at speeds close to 30 knots, which were excellent speeds in comparison to most of their competitors, whose speeds were in the 24-knot range, with the exception of the SS United States, which had a potential speed of 36 knots, and the airlines, which could reduce days to hours. Though technology could replace certain human capacities, there were those age-old chores that would always find their place on board a ship. Here a crew and boatswain would always find work painting and scrubbing. Down below, in the bowels of the ship, in the engine room, the life-giving force of the ship is carried on. An engineer plots the miles covered by the ship and the daily consumption of oil, which is used to manufacture energy in the ship's dynamos to generate electricity that will light the thousands of light fixtures throughout the ship. Oil would also be used to heat the Scotch boilers to create the steam that would pass through her rotors, thereby turning the four massive shafts. Oil, which had supplanted the former use of coal in the early 20s, had eliminated the black gangs, which consisted of crews of firemen, trimmers, and stokers who fed the furnaces continuously, day and night, to maintain speed. Now, in the late 60s, the black substance threatened the future of the Queens. Bunker fuel, which once sold for $60 a long ton, had skyrocketed over the years, causing many a ship line to fold. Undaunted by the higher costs, the Queens continued to ply the North Atlantic for the time being in the grand style of yesteryear. Her chefs and stewards, many of them veterans of former Canadas which had been retired, went on serving their passengers in the manner fit for kings and queens. No matter what the request, the Queens could accommodate any wish, from California strawberries to Maine lobster, English pheasant to Russian caviar. And the bill of fare became even more exotic through the 60s as the Queens competed with the airliners who flew ever more profusely overhead. In the late 40s and 50s, the passenger lists of the Queens had been a who's who of international names, carrying celebrities of all walks of life. Both prince and pauper, tourist and movie star, wished to see their names printed on the passenger lists of the Queens. By the middle of the 1960s, however, all this had changed. The great lounges and ballrooms of the Queens lacked the gaiety of the past, and even dining became lackluster. The social conventions of the world had gone through many transitions of change, even for would-be kings, who sought a simpler life in place of the pomp and ritual of the past. And that celebrated couple of the 60s, who made their honeymoon on one of the Queens, would signify that eventually all love affairs must come to an end. With the new decade came other unforeseeable troubles for the Queens. Numerous dock strikes on the Atlantic coast plagued the ships on many occasions when they had to dock without the assistance of pilot and tugs. But the Cunard captains were master mariners, whose apprenticeship of 15 years on earlier Cunards before they received their master's certificate made the delicate task seem like a daily chore. The line could somehow maneuver around these inconveniences, but the airlines were the real albatross. In 1960, Cunard was forced to sell the Britannic, the last survivor of the White Star Line fleet. She was followed by the sisters Medea and Parthia in 1961, and the Mauretania in 1965. The higher cost to maintain the Queens was to soon catch up with them by 1967, as the ebb tide for the liners took its course. Operating at a loss of about $2 million a year, Cunard decided to sell the Queen Mary to the highest bidder. In August, a deal was consummated with the city of Long Beach, California, for $3,450,000, where she would become a maritime museum, hotel, and convention center. But first there would be one last fling for the aging Queen, a 39-day cruise around Cape Horn to Long Beach. For her last voyage, passengers paid as much as $8,000 to make the final cruise. And after returning to New York for the last time, her captain expresses his sentiment.
Now that we've tied up here, I have a little sinking feeling in my stomach and a little sadness in my heart that this as well has been the last time for the Queen Mary to dock here in New York during the war. And probably a lot who have never had a chance to see the ship since and who might easily see her in California.
Do you see this as the end of an era, or at least the beginning of the end of an era?
Well, I think this is the end of this particular era.
An era had ended indeed, a gay and gilded one at that. As visitors say goodbye for the last time, they bid farewell to an idea, a way of life that would never return. Thousands of spectators, many of them who never traveled on an ocean liner, clustered to have a last glimpse of the paragon of ships, or to snap a photo as she passes Cunard's Pier 90 for the last time. The harbor craft blow their whistles and fireboats spray mountains of water as she steams downriver for the last time, where she passes another grand old lady. Under the Verrazano Bridge, her profile and prow, cutting through the waters as proud as the day when she entered the Hudson as a maiden. Past Ambrose Lighthouse at the entrance of the harbor, where the beacon stood as a landmark on so many of the Queen's westbound voyages. Upon her entry into Long Beach Harbor, the Mary is greeted by a flotilla of diverse tonnage, from the smallest sailboats to Coast Guard cutters, welcoming the Queen to another ocean, another life. From above, planes fly low, dropping red and white carnations on her upper decks as she is ushered in. After dry docking, the Mary undergoes refurbishing to a hotel and convention center, where tourists will come to visit and wonder perhaps, as they stand motionless from her boat deck, what it must have been like to travel on the Queen nearly a half a century ago. Meanwhile, the fate of the Queen Elizabeth was in the offing. With transatlantic travel by ship at half the figure of the decade before, it was not uncommon to see sparsely occupied decks on either of the Queens. And as one noted writer commented, it was possible for a single solitary passenger to turn up for tea in the dim depths of the Grand Saloon and sit magnificently alone, while a dozen white-jacketed stewards stood about like sentries, alert to his commands as he chose his sandwiches and scones from portable caddies, while all the pyramidal napkins and all the white tables in the gloaming multiplied his sense of isolation as the ship sailed into oblivion. In April 1968, the fate of the Elizabeth was sealed. She, too, would be sold as a tourist attraction at Port Everglades, Florida. The price tag, $7,750,000. As she left Pier 90 for the last time in September 1968, a troupe of Scottish bagpipers paid tribute to the industrial genius of another generation of Scotsmen who forged the great liner 3 decades before. The Elizabeth follows the same route down the Hudson as did her sister a year before, to warmer waters. But the future holds a different fate for the Elizabeth. Though the Mary's career as a floating hotel and convention center proved to be a success, the Queen Elizabeth would have no such tranquility in her retirement. Unlike the Mary, there would be no final bon voyage cruise for the Elizabeth, and her arrival at Port Everglades lacked the warm welcome received by the Mary's entrance into Long Beach a year earlier, with only a handful of small craft coming alongside to accommodate the Grand Lady to her new home. After lying idle at Port Everglades for nearly 6 months, the Elizabeth's interiors are to be auctioned off before her conversion. Gone are the thousands of deck chairs on her lonesome promenade decks. The foredeck, where sailors painted her capstans, and the sound of the boatswain's whistle are now silent. Auction tags are everywhere, from the binnacle to the steering wheel. The thousands of pieces of china have now become objects of memento to adorn a wall. Her 55,000 pieces of sterling and silver plate will bring in high prices. The many light fixtures will soon become conversation pieces in one's den. The dinnerware and plate covers that covered millions of gourmet meals. The crystal that toasted 1 million dinners and evening soirees. The teacups that heard so many a Viennese waltz in her grand saloons, now relics of the past. The American group behind the purchase of the Elizabeth were soon to run into financial difficulties when they could not raise the balance of the purchase price after the sell-off of the ship's interiors. The ensuing results were a foreclosure by Cunard who took the ship over again, opening her to visitors while a final disposition could be found for her. Down to the main deck, where the echoes of footsteps can be heard as they enter the grand hall with its high vaulted ceilings. The bar, where the cling of crystal and exuberant chatter have been silenced. The bridge, where her officers once stood in uniforms, dazzled with shining brass, now more desolate than the ghost ship in the rhyme of the ancient mariner. As time wore on, the situation grew dimmer for the Elizabeth as Kennard sought a favorable disposition for the ship. After nearly a year and a half of neglect, the liner becomes victim to the elements. Her foredecks are covered with rust, her decks buckling, as she stood motionless while a Boeing 707 flies pretentiously overhead. The only resolution Kennard could arrive at was to auction the ship for a second time. This time, fortune seemed more kindly when a Chinese shipping magnate by the name of C.Y. Tung purchased the Elizabeth in the autumn of 1970. The reprieve from obscurity had not come soon enough for Kennard, and as soon as the deal was finalized, the Elizabeth slowly lifted up anchor and set sail for the China Sea, her engines at half strength. She was to be fitted out in Hong Kong, where she would be converted to an educational cruise ship. Though her arrival lacked any fanfare, her new owner was to lavish almost as much on her conversion as did Kennard on her construction. The ship was placed under the banner of Tung's Orient Overseas Line in early 1972 for a cruise service. On January 9th, a few days before she was to sail on her maiden voyage in dazzling white glory, the Queen Elizabeth was engulfed in flames. Several conflagrations, which, said an official court of inquiry, must have been started deliberately by a person or persons unknown, combined into a raging firestorm that completely defeated the sprinkler and fireproof bulkhead system that had withstood so many localized blazes in the ship's history. This was the same misfortune that had befallen the French line's Normandie on February 9, 1942, when the liner caught fire from a worker's acetylene torch while being fitted out as a transport, though sabotage was never ruled out. As water was poured into the raging hull, the Normandie became top-heavy and keeled over, a total loss. For a day and a night, the firemen of Hong Kong hosed water into the Elizabeth until she, too, rolled over on her starboard side onto the harbor bottom, the skeleton half submerged and horribly contorted. It is not the way one wishes to remember the demise of the Queen Elizabeth or the unglorified ending of the Mary, but there was another ending for the Queens. At 12:10 a.m. on the 25th of September 1967, the two sisters had passed each other in mid-ocean for the last time, with a swiftness that had taken everyone by surprise. Together, the great ships, more than 160,000 tons of steel, closed the gap that separated them at a speed of nearly 60 miles an hour. As they cut the water deeply, pushing it aside in great crested arrowheads, they veered toward each other, almost as if to embrace, and all the lights blazing out scattered the dark night. The huge funnels glowing in their Kennard red, the basso profundo horns, belted out a sound that had less the quality of a salute than of one long mortal cry. Standing at attention on the port side wing of his flying bridge, the Elizabeth's captain doffed his hat. On the starboard wing of the Mary, her captain did the same, as though they had not walked there, but had somehow been instantly transported to the uppermost deck. The few passengers who had watched the sisters come out of the night now watched them go, and as the darkness closed in, the long wakes were rejoined. The sentimentalists stood for a while, watching the ocean recover its seamless immensity. Then one by one, like people dispersing downhill after a burial, they found their way to their cabins and closed their doors.